far as money and measurement are concerned, we've all got pounds, shillings and pence, but then add to that marks and groats, because they were common denominations, as were farthings, as were threepenny bits. Threepenny bits became very common in a much later period, but in the medieval period, you're looking at pounds, shillings, pence, marks and groats. Measurement was by different terms and different areas, because an acre we recognise today as 4,840 square yards. In this particular period, it varied in size. It was divided into bovates as the amount of land that could be ploughed in 1 year. So if you are on loamy or sandy soil, you're going to do more ploughing than if you're on clay soil. So a bovate in a sandy area will be bigger than a bovate in a clay area, and then that affects the size of the acre. A fee was the amount of land needed to support a knight, and when you look at manorial records, you will see that certain areas of a manor were reserved for the benefit of the lord of the manor, who received that land in return for knight service. So in other words, he became a knight, he was serving the king, and he got a piece of land in return. And if he had a big family, then his fee would be greater than if there was just him and a wife. A hired was the amount of land needed to support a family, and that varied anything between 60 and 180 acres. A vergate was a quarter of a hired. And you can see that, all of these are variable based on how much land was needed to support a family or what could be ploughed in a year. So don't automatically assume that when you see the word acre in a record, don't try and visualize what an acre looks like today, if indeed you can, because everybody now works in hectares and goodness knows what else. There are two extremely useful websites which I recommend that you look at as you do your research and even before. One is the Medieval Names Archive, which is www.s-gabriel.org, and the other one is medievalgenealogy.org.uk. They are both extremely useful. The medieval genealogy one is the one that contains a lot of information on calendars, sources of information, and so on and so forth. The Medieval Names Archive is the one that actually gives you a lot more information about how names appeared, why they appeared, what regional differences there were, and so on and so forth. So you're not being left alone on this. There is plenty of stuff out there for you to find information as you go. One of the big challenges is you're going to get to a record office and you're going to wonder what the hell you're doing. And again, if you prepare beforehand, or if you've got some idea, it will make life a lot easier. So that's the new skills. Let's now have a look at the actual records. Most documents look the same because they were generated either by the government or the courts. So they're legal documents, and they're usually identifiable by the wording at the start. In other words, the formulary. When you look at a will, you've got in the name of God, amen, or this is the last will and testament. Different types of documents started in different ways. And again, I'll show you a few, but not all of them. And you need to use research guides issued by National Archives and places like that to understand the formulary that will appear, so that you know which type of document you're looking at. Because if you get a bundle of legal documents from a manor, they're all going to be together. So you've got to determine whether you're looking at a deed, whether you're looking at a will, whether you're looking at a quitclaim or whatever. And that it depends upon the first half dozen words of the document. Many of the documents will have seals on, and record officers are particularly careful about issuing documents with seals. You'll probably find you'll get it in a molded box and you can't take it out or you can't move it. If you do damage a seal, for goodness sake, tell them don't hide it, because their conservators can get it back onto the document. A lot of record officers have actually removed the seals from documents for practical purposes. But that, again, you know, to me, doesn't give the authenticity if the seal's missing. The records of the period really fall into two distinct groups. Those that are identified by name, and these include things like wills, inquisitions post-mortem, which has nothing to do with post-mortem, they're inquiries after death, and I'll explain that in a minute or two. Coroner's records, what they call the patent and close rolls, Privy Council records, state papers domestic, and lawsuits. And you've probably not heard of any of those, or some of them you probably won't have heard of, but these are the type of documents that are available, because these are the legal documents of the period that you're going to need to use to find information. The other group is by place. So you have something called a feat of fines, you have muster rolls, you have taxation records, have subsidy rolls, pipe rolls, and so on and so forth. And those are probably more familiar to you because you will start using those fairly early on in your research. You know, you look at a muster roll for a local militia, you look at taxation records for the hearth tax or the window tax or hair powder duty. Subsidy rolls is to do with land tax. Feats of fines, if you're looking at deeds or documents now, you're inevitably looking at a feat of fine because it's the bottom third of a document. And with legal documents, you have three parts. So you have one part that's given to one party, one part that's given to another, and the bit along the bottom, which usually has a wavy line along the top, is called the feat of fines. And that's the bit that's registered. That's the bit that will appear in archives. So let's just have a quick look at formally for some of the more popular types of records. So, you know, for wills, it's in the name of God, amen. For a bond, it's know all men by these presents. For a deed of gift, it's know all present and future to have and to hold or rendering. For a bargain and sale or a lease, it's this indenture. For a fine, it's the final agreement. For common recoveries, it's the name of the reigning monarch, and so on and so forth. And you'll become familiar with these as you go through and do your actual research. Any records relative to manorial records vary depending upon the manner. So let's start with manorial records. Let's have a look at what they are, because these are the best source of information that you will find in the sort of medieval period. But technically, manorial records actually go right the way up to 1925, albeit that in the 1860s, 1870s with enfranchisement, they tended to fade into oblivion. But you can start becoming familiar with manorial records as soon as you get back into the early 1800s of research. And they are a good source. You know, they are the best source of records to trace ancestors for the lowest levels of medieval society. So if you've got peasants, you've got serfs, you've got labourers, manorial records are the best place to look because they contain names of literally hundreds of people. They're in effect the local government of the day. Everybody would be involved. Everybody had to attend at court. Everybody was subject to rents of the manor and so on and so forth. That document on the right-hand side there is actually a 4-generation pedigree pre-parish registers where somebody had to prove that they were entitled to inherit an estate on a manor or a tenancy on a manor. So although it's not written in the format of a drop-line pedigree, you can actually piece together from that information. And this dates back to about 1220, 1230. You know, you've got generations running back from sort of the early 1400s right the way back to the early 1200s in that pedigree that exists there. So, albeit that, you know, it's not an official record as such, it is a legal document. So therefore, in the absence of anything else, it's the only thing you can base your information on. So the manor, you know, it's a record of people of all social classes in a particular area. And the manor was a large landed estate It could have been divided into two or more for administrative or rent collection purposes, but that's not particularly important. What is important that there were about 19,000 manors covering the 11,000 parishes in England and Wales. So some manors, some parishes might have more than one manor, and that means you've got to do double research or whatever. Manor names often don't bear any resemblance to the parish, town or village that they're part of. And manors were abolished in 1925 when the Law of Property Act abolished copyhold tenure, because everybody held land apart from the knights and the lords of the manor who had freeholds. Everybody else, in effect, had a lease or a rented property. Don't be fooled by the fact that manor houses that exist today are the seat of the gentry from way back. A lot of people call their houses the manor house, and they're not the manor houses relative to the manor, but they could be, and in some instances they are. So just take a view on it. The whole setup of the manor was to be directed by the manorial court, and all of the tenants had to attend the court. From the tenants, the jury was elected, officers of the manor were elected. Everybody that was admitted to the manor or moved away from the manor had to go through an admission and surrender process that were dealt with in one or two of the manorial courts. There was the court baron and the court leet. And there are subtle differences, which, you know, if you want to go deeper, then you need to listen to a talk on manorial records. But, you know, these are supported by rentals. So the rentals are a list of names of tenants with a description of the property and the rent that they paid. Rents were collected on a regular basis, about twice a year. It could have been cash or produce. But in some manors, you'll find that the rentals were only made on change of the lord of the manor. So you don't get your half yearly or your annual lists of tenants, because they only collected rents when the lord of the manor changed. And there could be 10, 15 years between manorial records, but it's something you just have to take part look at as you look at manorial records. Most manorial records are supported by maps and surveys. And from the 16th century onwards, surveyors were actually employed to do this. So the maps tend to be a little bit more accurate, but they do provide details of the holdings, of the boundaries, topographical features, and so on and so forth. And the black and white one there, although you can't see it, at the top left-hand corner gives a list of all the tenants of the manor at the time the survey was taken, and the plan enables you to visualize where the manor was. Might be completely different today because areas might be urbanized and you can't recognize where the manor was. But, you know, at least you can see in a contemporary format the actual layout of the manor at the time that you're doing your research. So what actually do manorial records tell us? They'll give us vital dates. They'll tell us changes in tenancies. They'll tell us the role of in the community of the tenants standing. May give you clues to literacy, because many documents were signed by tenants. So if they couldn't read or write, they signed with a cross. It's certainly a good idea to sort of pick out the social structure. You know, who were the big players? Who were the small fry in the manors? Where did they fit into the social structure? And as such, what social tensions existed? You know, where were the fracture lines in the community? What were the economic relationships? Who had credit? Who, you know, was able to self-sustain themselves? If you're doing a property history, then it's extremely useful to find details of the house or the tenement that they occupied. If you're looking at environmental history, then, you know, what happened? You know, where were the commons? Where were the grazing rights? Where were the footpaths that ran through the manor? Because most of these are, you know, historically there. You know, a common hasn't just automatically come into something in the 20th century. It's been there for years, centuries. There is a slight problem with manorial records, as with all other medieval documents. You the extent of coverage depends on the original size of the manor. The records of the larger manors or those with ecclesiastical affiliations tend to be the ones that will survive more. But the survival of the records literally is pot luck. And you need to work out the geographical coverage of the manor because it's not exactly the same necessarily as the parish. And the oldest surviving manorial record that we know of in this country dates from 1240. So you're not going to find manorial records much before that time period. There are some pitfalls in research. Don't assume that because records cover a particular period that all the information is included. Catalogues can vary. I looked at I went to the British Library to look at some manorial records that they held because their catalogue told me that this particular set of documents covered the period from, I think it was about 1450 to about 1600. There are actually two documents, one in 1450, one in 1600, and absolutely nothing in the middle. So they're just taken a before and end date, a start and end date, there'd be nothing, but the catalogue doesn't detail that for you. Quality of records will vary considerably because, again, they're old, depends upon the steward of the clerk, the manor writing them out. Don't always expect to find all the answers. Records might contain a lot of information, but there might only be a brief bit of information about your ancestors. So, like all these records, don't use them in isolation. But to be able to use them, you've got to use something called the Manorial Documents Register. And this, again, sits in the National Archives in the Discovery. If you go onto National Archives, type in Manorial Documents Register in the search field, it will come up, gives you some information about how to use it, asks you to put in either the name of the manor if you know it, or the parish, historic county, and then it will come up with the manors covering that particular area. As you can see on the right-hand side, there are 4 manors in the parish of Henlow. Henlow is a poxy little village in the middle of Bedfordshire, but it was actually covered by 4 manors. So this is where you've got one parish with more than one manor in it. And the Manorial Documents Register will tell you how to do that. Moving on to things like deeds and legal documents, which is where most of the information is going to come from. Deeds are the most valuable and abundant form of historical document. In many instances, they're unclassified, they're dirty, they are totally ignored by family historians, and I never understand why. Because they provide a crucial link in the sequence of family relationships. Very often they deal with land inheritance. They will deal with marriage settlements. And again, the deeds are often in Latin, and some of them will have their own language, but they're not difficult to read and if you take your time to understand what they're saying. And very often, like all legal documents, they can be summarized in a few words. And because of that, they're probably considered insignificant. You might look at a legal document that covers 3 pages of parchment, and the information you want is sort of 10 points. They're considered to be associated with property, not people, but how wrong you are. A deed cannot be instigated by a property. It has to be instigated by a person to a person, and so on and so forth. So what deeds relate to people? Marriage settlements. And that's not just for the well-to-do. Same with family settlements. Mortgage deeds. Mortgages are not a 20th century invention to buy a house. They've been around for a long while, as of leases. Fines and recoveries. These are where people sue people for damages and things like that. Bargains and sale, which in effect are what we today would call conveyances. Quit claims are very much associated with manorial records, because a quit claim is where somebody converts their copyhold interest to a freehold interest as a result of enfranchisement, which was allowed. But they're much later. You don't get many quit claims in the medieval period. But I mentioned earlier a little bit about parts of deeds. And the deeds that were granted were built in three parts. And the first part is the defaultant, which was given to the seller. The second part was the querent, which was given to the purchaser. And the bit along the bottom was the foot. In other words, the feet of fines, and that's the part that's registered. And down those joins, the vertical joint and the horizontal joint, all of the deeds were cut with a curved line. And on that curved line, there will be a series of lines adjoining, so that if you match them together, you knew you had the actual document, because the crosses across the join would meet. And when you look at a legal document, just take a note of where the curved sides of the document are to see which one you're looking at. Law terms are particularly important as well. There were four. There was Michaelmas, Hilary, Easter and Trinity. Don't worry too much about the dates there, because they were slightly movable depending upon Easter. But the law terms were the terms that judges sat to deal with civil matters. In between times, in between the law terms, they held the assize to deal with criminal matters. Wills, again, we should all be pretty familiar with wills, because they don't change in the medieval period other than the language or the way in which they're written. Most of them are on parchment or paper. Most wills date from 1100 onwards. They were originally signed and sealed. The probate copy has a certificate of probate attached. And the key phrase, as we said earlier, is "in the name of God, amen," or "this is the last will and testament of." A lot of private charters existed. So you have conveyances, property rights, individual deeds and documents, and they can be found in most record offices. They all tend to look the same. They all tend to be, legal documents with a seal on it, with a signature, and the wording is the important bit. Feet of fines, having talked about feet of fines, that's an example. And you can see the wavy line along the top, and you can see all those marks that will correspond with the other two parts of the deed if you've got the correct deed. They're an ancient deed detailing agreements or final contours to resolve property disputes. And there were a lot. You didn't have to be a freeholder to have a property dispute. You could be a tenant, you could be a leaseholder or whatever. And they became a common way of registering a conveyance. So, before we had sort of land registration and things like that, they were used to record conveyances. And they were written out 3 times, and it's the bottom copy that's held by the court, and it's the bottom copy, it's the feet of fines that you see. And interestingly enough, a lot of them have been indexed and published. Inquisitions post-mortem existed up to 1660, organised by county. Most of the originals were in Latin, but again, they've been transcribed in a lot of cases. They comply to a standard format. So they give you the name of the county, they give you the official, the jurors, the name of the deceased, the date of death, the description of the deceased holding, any will extract, the name, age and sex of the heir. So you've automatically got at least 2 generations in an inquisition post-mortem. And they were conducted in accordance with established legal proceedings. And essentially they're local inquiries into land held by people to establish what income and rights were due to the Crown. In other words, these are the things that people base taxes on. But they do contain a lot of information of genealogical value. And as I say, many of them have been transcribed, certainly up to 1509. So, that's fine. And there is a website called inquisitionspostmortem.ac.uk, again, where most of the details about the IPMs can be found. Coroner's records. Coroner's inquests began in 1194, and they investigated unnatural, sudden or suspicious deaths and all deaths in prisons. That has not altered. That's still the role of a coroner today. Before 1929, inquests were always with a jury. They don't need to be today. But don't get slightly confused, because they are the results of the documents are inquisitions. So you get the verdict, you get the name, you get the date, you get the time, the cause of death, and the place of death, which you may be able to deduce from newspapers or other documentation. But in the very early period, particularly in those published between 1265 and 1413, you will need that information to be able to go further back. And because they're published, you don't necessarily have to look at the original documents. And in some instances, record officers won't release them because of the conservation issues. A lot of the supporting evidence doesn't exist, so you won't get witness statements and things like that. But they do give a great insight into the social conditions of the time that aren't revealed in many other records. So taxation records. Taxes, like any other time period, were a major feature of medieval life. It really was. And they were very often levied for specific purposes. Every single level of society had to pay taxes. The amounts obviously varied, but it produced lists on a regular basis of taxpayers for each 100. Now, we haven't talked about hundreds before, but these are sort of administrative areas of the counties. And they were split into two. They were lay subsidies, or they were the dreaded poll tax. So, subsidy and tax records, known colloquially as tenths and fifths, and the raising of taxes began in 1290. And a new tax system needed names recorded for every taxpayer. They were working exchequer documents, so a lot of them are now in the National Archives under the Exchequer series. Taxes on income or land, and can be levied on people's possessions as well as property. Includes poor peasants as well as the merchants and the well-to-do. But in reality terms, only about 60% of households actually paid tax, because all of these had exemption levels. So the really, really, really poor, if they were in receipt of poor relief or any sort of subsidy, didn't pay tax for that particular year. So you may find that in one year they do, in another year they don't. Lay subsidies, the first Edward's Wars led to a new method of raising money. So the taxes were introduced, assessed on the wealth, the movable wealth of somebody, not property. So this was on their chattels and their possessions. They're most useful between 1290 and 1332. And the poor didn't normally appear in the actual lay subsidy rolls. But there are lists of names by parish. A lot of returns no longer survive, but those that do are in class E179 at National Archives. And that is a database. You can go on to the Discovery website and you can actually call up the database of the lay subsidies. Some counties have lists and some have been published, but the E179 database online gives you the information. So it gives you an information sheet when you do it. It gives you a search, so you can search it for an individual, and then you will get the listing for that particular area together with the value of the goods and the amount of tax they paid. In its own right, probably not that valuable, but at least it's identifying somebody as being in an area when the tax was collected or paid. And because it's online, it's easy to use. You don't have to worry about going to a record office and churning up different records and being able to read Latin and goodness knows what else. It's there for you to look at.